Yeah, good evening. I'm Sandeep here. On behalf of Welcome, I take the privilege to welcome all of our eminent speaker, chairpersons, and panelists here. Thank you for being here, taking time. I also welcome all the attendees in CritiQuest 2. CritiQuest 2 is the second in a row of our such initiatives to have a knowledge disseminations in COVID-19 pandemic situations. So the last program was very successful, and I believe that you will get a lot of insights from this program as well. With that, I would like to hand over the forum to Dr. Chirag Tehli, who is heading our medical affairs team for this purpose. And Dr. Chirag, you can introduce our chairperson, Dr. Srivastava.
Yeah, thank you, Sandeep. Thank you so much. Very warm welcome to each and each participant for today's evening. SARS-CoV-2, the name who has come to our life and last around 100 odd days. It is very dynamic situation, changing almost every day and completely unprecedented. If I would look at the situation in India, India reported the first case of COVID-19 in Kerala in January 30th. Around the same time, the worst affected countries in Asia and the West reported their first casualties. Around 85 odd days later, by today, India had a little more than 21,000 cases of coronavirus infection. Although one analysis suggests that India is standing with the key countries like of the West, like US, UK, and some European countries as well, which have already seen more than same rate of infection and much more casualties than India. And it found that it has outperformed most developed nations in the curbing this pandemic. But we have lost more than 650 lives by today. There are significant patients who are developing pneumonia, ARDS, multi-organ involvement, and further complications, which leaves us with many questions, which we look forward to experts to guide us, such as how we can monitor, how we intervene at the right time, what are the measures to avoid the complication, and in turn, to save the precious human lives. To know on these points, on these questions, we have today a team of experts who will provide us valuable guidance and the way forward to deal with this situation better. With that note, I welcome chairperson of today's session, Dr. Om Srivastava, and it is my privilege to welcome Dr. Om Srivastava, who is the Director of Critical Care at Jaslok Hospital, Mumbai. I hand over to you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I just need to make one small correction. I am the Director of Infectious Diseases and not Critical Care at Jaslok Hospital. But thank you once again for your introduction. I'd like to welcome everybody from the panelists to the guests to the speakers. I think there is enough to talk about wasting time. I'm going to get started. It is my pleasure to invite Dr. Sandeep Diwan to start the meetings. Dr. Diwan, of course, is, in this case, he is the head of critical care at Hospital Gurgaon. And may I invite you, Dr. Diwan, to please start your presentation.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, sir, for the kind introduction. Can everybody see the slide, I hope? Just put it on the slide share. So the next 15 minutes, we'll try to look at the COVID-19 and try to compare the global and the Indian perspective. And that's what the aim is for the next few 15-20 minutes. So,
sir, you can put it on the full screen mode.
I'll put it on the full screen. Full screen. Is it okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So we all know SARS-CoV-2 as it's called. It's a large enveloped positive strand RNA viruses. Disease caused by this virus has been labeled as COVID-19, and there are 4 human coronaviruses which have been known till now. and they approximately cater to 30% of URTIs. These are all zoonotic viral pathogens and high transmission potentials. If you look at the electron microscopy, the coronavirus mainly involves the airway epithelial cells, and that's why most of the patients are coming to us with the respiratory problems. But it's not that it is only restricted to respiratory system. It can involve the cardiovascular system, and there are certain reports of multi-organ damage also. This is of the timelines of how it has evolved all across the world. 31st December was the first case of pneumonia when a Chinese ophthalmologist identified that they were finding pneumonias of unknown etiology, which was having a SARS-like illness, but not exactly SARS. 7th January, a new type of coronavirus was detected. 9th January, WHO gave a statement that yes, a new kind of novel coronavirus has been spreading in Wuhan. By 13th January, it has spread to Thailand. By 20th January, we had 282 cases in areas adjoining China, Thailand, Japan, and Korea. US had its first case on 23rd January, France 25th, UAE, and India had its first case, as was told previously on 30th January. 30th January, it was declared as a public health emergency of international concern, and the actual terminology of SARS-CoV-2 was designated on 11th February. By 11th March, it had been declared as a pandemic. So if you look at the global perspective, we have been dealing with this virus since end of December. A look at the current scenario. This is the global burden. To about 26 lakhs people have been infected. Out of that, 1,84,000 patients have died and 7,17,000 approximately have recovered. If you compare it with India, this is as per today's 23rd April data, 21,000 odd cases, 681 deaths, and 4,370 patients have recovered. If you compare the closed cases, which means the cases which have had an outcome, and you divide them into recovered and deaths, if you look at the global data, about 20% of the closed cases have resulted in mortality, and as we are seeing that in India, it's about 13% till now. If you compare the number of closed cases with the mortality. If you look at India in the scheme of things across the world, I'm sure everybody is following it on a daily basis. USA is at the top with about 8.5 lakh cases and about 47,000 deaths, then followed by Spain, Italy, and all the other countries in Europe, France, Germany, UK, and India stands 17th with 21,000 cases, 681 deaths, 4,000 recovered. Active cases which are still there in India are 16,000 odd cases. If you look at per million population, we have 15 cases per million population, which is very less as compared to the other countries in the world. The deaths, 0.5 per million population. Total tests done, and that's where everybody keeps on asking. I was hearing to this interview of Dr. Gangadhar from ICMR that we have tested till 462 tests have been done, and it's 335 tests per million population. Quite low as compared to what the other countries of the world have been testing, particularly of the likes of USA, France, and the Germany's about 24,000 per million. Switzerland, Portugal have tested quite a lot, but it's been improving considerably. If you compare this data, this was around 160 per million about few days back, and now it's come to 335. So testing is improving in the country, but still far from what other countries are doing. Now, if you look at the total confirmed COVID-19 deaths, and if you look at how rapidly they are increasing, this is the data which was calculated after the first 5 deaths had happened. And if you look at it in the span of approximately 36 odd days, we have had 507 deaths, which has gone to 681 as of today. But yes, that is the whole aim of lockdown, that that the number of cases should go down, but also that if the number of cases is less, we are dealing with lesser mortality, because the healthcare systems will not be overburdened with the type of cases which we are seeing in Italy or in US. If you look at state-wise distribution of COVID burden in India, there are certain states which have definitely have the likes of community spread, which looks like, as the first you can see is in Maharashtra, confirmed cases 5,649, 269 deaths. Then it's followed by Delhi, which has 2,000 odd cases, followed by Gujarat, 1,900 odd cases, then Tamil Nadu, Rajasthan, and you can see other Madhya Pradesh. Another we have Dr. Anand Sanghi from Indore. Indore actually is coming up as a hotspot, and you can see almost every state or union territory had some odd cases. If you look at the number of tests, and if you look at the confirmed cases and the reported deaths, as from the time of lockdown, which was on 23rd March, and the testing strategy was expanded by ICMR, which basically including inviting more private labs to start doing testing. I don't know the exact number, but at the last which I had confirmed, about 91 private labs have been recognized by ICMR to do the testing. And because the testing has increased, so that's where the graph of the total confirmed cases has been going up since then. The national lockdown was also in parallel done from 24th March, and it was extended on 13th April. So yes, the numbers are going up because we are testing more and more symptomatic patients. And there was an advisory by the central government yesterday that all patients who are admitted in the hospitals will be tested for COVID now. So that will further expand the testing in the country. But as if you look at a suspect case, whom do you test? I'm sure all of you have read it multiple times, but it's keep on expanding every few days. All symptomatic individuals who have undertaken travel within the last 14 days. Now this criteria has actually become vague now, because this was relevant a month back, but now because the international travels have not happened since 18th March, so this 14-day international travel carries no meaning now. All symptomatic contacts of laboratory confirmed cases. So if you have come in contact with a COVID positive case, you have to be tested. Symptomatic healthcare personnel. Symptomatic healthcare personnel means you have fever, you have cough, you are going to the hospital, you should be tested. All hospitalized patients with SARS, which is basically includes fever, cough, and breathlessness. Asymptomatic, direct and high risk contacts of confirmed cases. That is where I think most of the healthcare workers are getting involved in India, because you suddenly get a patient which is COVID positive, and a few healthcare workers have been exposed to these patients without a proper PPE. So they go into quarantine, but they need to be tested on 5th and 14th day. And they also need to measure their temperature regularly, at least twice a day. Symptomatic, what does it refers to? It basically includes fever, cough, and shortness of breath. Direct and high risk contacts are those who live in the same household as a confirmed case, or any healthcare worker who is examined a confirmed case. And a confirmed case is defined as a patient or a person who has a laboratory confirmation of COVID-19, irrespective of clinical signs and symptoms. So even asymptomatic have been included in it. If you look at the timelines, very variable. We had one patient who tested positive after 18 days of symptoms and was admitted with us 3 days back. So very variable timeline. But if you look at the gross, the incubation period is about 5 to 7 days. And in about 8 to 9 days, you'll start getting dyspneas. And then it progresses to ARDS by 11th to 12th days. And most of the patients who go into severe category will need an ICU admission. But if you look at the overall mortality, if you look at these two graphs, which is compare survival versus non-survivors, the orange is the fever, which is not the differentiating factor. The second factor is the cough, The dyspnea, it's both, all of them are starting at the same day, day 6 or so. ICU admission by day 12, and by 15, those who are requiring invasive ventilation are having a higher mortality. And there's a lot of data which is showing that the ICU mortality, particularly of ventilated patients, is as variable as from 40 to 70%, depending on the situation. So the red color actually is the coming out to be a differentiator. Systematic corticosteroids, whether you are giving or not giving, a matter of debate. And obviously the test starts to become positive from the first day, but it is highly variable. There's a 30% false negative reporting. So if you are testing too early, you may be dealing with a false negative patients. We have had a scenario where we have had to send samples twice or thrice because the clinical suspicion was very high, and but the initial RT-PCR had come out to be negative. So initial RT-PCR should be taken with a pinch of salt, particularly if you are having a high clinical suspicion of SARS. If you look at the comparatives, many patients have required ventilatory support, but those who go on a ventilatory support, unfortunately, if you compare with MERS and SARS, they have a higher mortality. The period of infectivity is uncertain. Transmission from symptomatic patients, the China report says about 1.5% from asymptomatic, while the Singapore says to about 6.4%. So it's quite variable. Duration of shedding, when the patient sheds the maximum viral load, is also variable. Some data shows that it can be start from 3rd day. Some days it says starts from 7th day. If you look at the RO of COVID-19 as far as India is concerned, it's going down to 1.36 now. There is some estimation that we'll have 25,000 cases by April end at this rate. But I'm telling you, this analysis has failed in India multiple times, because there was a study which says by April end India would have a few lakh cases, but which has been taken aback, and we all know that study, and it's now a fresh one which says to 25,000, which looks more realistic. But I feel as the testing will go up, we may see large numbers coming up. Patient characteristics, it can be mild or severe. The pattern of the fever, the cough and the fatigue these are the 3 major symptoms, but I'm sure you are all following the clinical records. We have seen elective surgery patients coming out to be COVID positive. We have seen acute MI patients who have undergone primary PCI, and after PCI they have come out to be COVID positive. But if you look at the major clinical features, these are fever, cough, fatigue, anorexia, shortness of breath, myalgias, and anosmia. Risk factors: diabetes, hypertension, chronic vascular diseases, lung disease, immunocompromised patients, CKD, anything which basically decreases your immunity makes the patient at high risk for COVID. As I told you, median time to dyspnea is about 5 to 8 days. Median time to ARDS is about 8 to 12 days. And ICU admission is generally required in about 10 to 12 days. Among all hospitalized patients, 26 to 32% patients require admission to the ICU, which is quite a high number. But this has come from the CDC. Among all patients, 3 to 17% develop ARDS. Again, very variable if you look at the percentage of ARDS, compared to a range of 20 to 40% for hospitalized patients. So let's assume it has about 10 to 15% incidence of ARDS. Mortality, again, very variable, from as low as 39% to as high as 72%. And median length of hospitalization is 10 to 13 days. It can go as high as 23 days, 24 days. No data is still, reliable data is available regarding the reinfection with SARS-CoV-2. Now, if you are following the WHO reports, a report came yesterday which says that when they tried to look at the antibody profile of the survivors of COVID-2, only 2 to 3% had antibodies in them. The rest, they didn't find any antibodies. So are these patients who don't have antibodies are at a higher risk of reinfection? Could be not. But then it also puts in a greater question on the rapid testing that we are doing, because if the positive patients are not developing any antibodies, does rapid testing make any rationale once you're looking at the doing it as a surveillance measure. This is from New York. I would not take too much details, but what it basically says is the demographics of the patient. Most patients were of the higher age group. The median age is about 62, and those who also required invasive ventilation were of the higher age group. More male predominance. Smoking was a risk factor. Obesity, diabetes, hypertension, all these were risk factors, as I already explained. And if you look at the percentage of mortality, it's about 40 patients, but the death rate is about 10% in New York. Laboratory findings: lymphopenia is the most common finding. Leukocytosis, then you have elevated liver enzymes, classical, which happens in every viral disease. What some correlation is coming, and there's this study going on in Singapore, where they are correlating ferritin and IL-6 levels with the severity of the disease. I'm sure the ICMR is also planning to do some studies. Procalcitonin may be normal. D-dimer elevation may be associated with higher mortality. But this, as I told you, there's so much literature which has come in last 3 months that to comprehend what to practice and what to leave, it's not going to be an easy job. If you look at the different kind of specimens, because that is highly debated, what is the best specimen to send? But to summarize, if you are sending the first sample, it should be a combination of nasal and pharyngeal swab. But please understand, it has to be really sent deep to the posterior pharyngeal wall to take the adequate sample. Otherwise, the false negative incidence is high. Then one can go for a sputum, which is again has a 75% positive test results. The better than that is if the patient is intubated, it's an endotracheal aspirate or a bronchial lavage. But it has been seen in feces. It has not till now been seen in urine, but there's enough report which says that it's seen in feces to about 6 to 8 weeks. Today, there is a literature which came that in asymptomatic carriers, the course COVID-2 virus has also been found in salivary glands. So they are thinking that that may be acting as a reservoir for asymptomatic COVID patients. So still a lot to be learned on what areas it's involving. Testing strategy, which is India specific. If you are finding any cluster or a containment zone, which basically means large gatherings, you evacuate those centers, and if the patient has ILI-like symptoms like cold, fever, sore throat, you do a rapid test. This is more from surveillance. Rapid test.
5 minutes, sir.
Sorry.
5 minutes, sir.
Yeah, it will finish. So if the test is positive, if your rapid antibody test is positive, you treat that patient as a positive case and put the patient in home isolation, because this is mainly for asymptomatic or mild ILI-like patients. If the rapid antibody test is negative, one has two options. You can confirm it with an RT-PCR. If the RT-PCR comes out positive, patient needs to be sent for a hospital treatment or home isolation, depending on the criticality. If it's negative, it's a non-COVID ILI. If for some reason the PCR cannot be done, because India is a large country, we can see a lot of my colleagues who are in the tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 cities, they don't have availability of RT-PCR. They can repeat the test after 10 days, but they need to keep the patient on home quarantine. And if after 10 days the rapid test comes out to be positive, the patient will need home isolation. So this is a strategy which is given by ICMR to utilize testing strategy in India. Clinical management, I will not go into details because I think there are a lot of questions, and Dr. Sri Lakshmi will be talking about some cases that they have managed. We have managed 18 cases till now, 3 ventilated, 1 ventilated has been discharged, 1 went into bad cytokine storm, so we end up giving tocilizumab, and then we also use cytosol. He's currently off vasopressors, AKI is recovered, but still vented, and another young patient. So the rest are doing well. I feel that the disease is more milder in our country. As Dr. Pradeep was also saying, they have only milder cases till now. But yes, we don't know how it pans out as we start testing more and more patients. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Diwan. I think that some of the figures that you have quoted are so recent. They're probably, as early as this morning, this afternoon, that they were
Yes.
reported. Some of the other things that you have shared are quite remarkable. The only thing that came out from one of the other respectable journals was that ventilatory patients, as you've already rightly pointed out, can have a poor outcome of anywhere from about 45% to about 90%. And the 45% actually comes from the data coming out of a Southeast Asian country. I'm not going to go into those details, but most of the European countries and the American centers are actually showing far worse mortality for reasons that are probably beyond the scope of this meeting. So I'd like to thank you again one more time, Dr. Diwan.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
If there are any questions right now, can we take 3 questions? We'll take 3 questions. Can I request anybody who's got a very specific question for Dr. Diwan?
Doctor, there are 3 questions in the Q&A box. There are about 4 questions.
Okay, so let's read them out.
Any role of antibody for doctor to join duty after exposure?
Any role of antibody for a doctor to join duty after exposures?
So the protocol says that if the doctor is going on a quarantine after a COVID duty, okay, if they have taken a proper PPE protection, which is level 3 PPE in the COVID ward, okay, and if they are asymptomatic, okay, they don't need any testing. But that is for a level 3 PPE, which is difficult to really replicate in our country. Most of the time what we are getting is the level 2 PPE. The level 3 PPEs, you have an extra hood on for the aerosol protections. Okay? So I think antibody, definitely no, but if you have a doubt that you have some mild sore throat, it is definitely recommended that on 5th and 14th day you get a RT-PCR done before you return to the duty. That's what we are doing for our fellows who are doing COVID duties right now. Rapid antibody is mainly for screening, and it's for mass screening in the containment zone. It's not meant for hospitals or healthcare workers. For healthcare workers, it has to be RT-PCR.
So the next question, role of anticoagulation for prevention of pulmonary embolism.
Very good question, actually. As Dr. Om had mentioned, the ARDS that we are seeing, I'm sure you all have seen Dr. Gattinoni's paper and the webinar that he did, where they are defining there are 2 types of patients that we are seeing in COVID. One is a atypical patient where you have a high compliance, lesser plateau pressures. So those patients are not actually fitting into classical ARDS and they are non-responsive to PEEP. In those cases, what they are seeing is that the shunt fraction, the shunt effect is very high. So probably there you have a situation where there is more of a microvascular thrombosis happening in the pulmonary circulation. The second category is the classical ARDS, where you will find a low compliance, bad plateau pressures. Okay, but what is happening is when we are doing the management, we are only giving the DVT prophylaxis dose to those patients. Okay? Because most of them will be at a higher risk of bleeding. The one patient that we ventilated and who's been discharged, his hypoxia was not improving in spite after extubation. So I think we are learning that maybe ventilating late would be a better option. And then we got a CT angio done and he had bilateral pulmonary embolism. Then we started him on anticoagulation on a full dose, and over a period of few days the saturation improved. So yes, if you have a high suspicion of pulmonary embolism, you must do a full dosage of anticoagulation.
Sir, can we take the remaining questions after the panel discussion, sir?
Okay, just before we go, I'd like to, since we are already on to the topic of antibodies, Dr. Diwan, could you give us your opinion about the role of neutralizing antibodies? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, sir, the literature is very less. You are talking about the plasma therapy of
No,
neutralizing?
I'd like to, I'm sorry, I should explain myself. A neutralizing antibody is, so it's not enough for a patient to have an antibody. It
Okay.
needs to be able to be neutralizing, because otherwise you are not going to be correcting that part of the immune response unless the antibody is a neutralizing one. That therefore, it's probably more relevant to the discussion that we'll be having a little later. But I thought I'd like to make that point because we are speaking a great deal in some of the public platforms about antibodies, but it's not enough to have an antibody. You need to know whether your patient has a neutralizing antibody. That is
Okay.
important in clinical outcomes.
Okay.
I am going to once again thank Dr. Diwan. It's a very nice talk. We'd like to probably have you give more of these talks. It is enjoyable, thoroughly enjoyable.
Thank you, sir. Thank
But
you
then
very
I think
much.
what we need to do is to keep a couple of hours only for questions, answers, and maybe a debate. Yes.
Yeah, I think that would be a much better way of doing it, sir. If we can have more queries, I think a lot of questions come in these COVID seminars these days, which are relevant clinically. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm now going to invite Dr. Sri Kala.
Sri Lakshmi.
Sri Lakshmi, I'm very sorry. Please,
No.
look, my apologies.
No.
Let me start again. I'm now going to invite Dr. Sri Lakshmi to start with her part of the talk. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity. And I really want to also extend my gratitude for Dr. Pradeep Rangappa, Secretary of Karnataka IC Critical Care Society, for asking me to do this. I'm a consultant in critical care at Peterborough City Hospital, Cambridgeshire. This is about what we have found, how our management perspective of the cases which we have come across in Peterborough City Hospital. So far, we have had about 253 cases in our hospital, and out of which 51 cases have required ICU admission, and we have had about 18 deaths in our ICU, and 13 have been discharged back to the wards, and some have gone home uneventfully. And altogether in hospital death, it's about 58 deaths we have had. This is our background. Now, just wanted to start off with how looking at some of the questions which might be coming in the way, as in what did we do right, or what we thought, what we have done a few things right as we started off. So when pretty much March 2nd week, we were told about yes, this is what is going to happen in the next few weeks. So 2nd week of March, we started with preparations. And in that preparation, first and foremost, we started with simulation. Simulation for all the critical care doctors as well as anesthetists for both intubation, ALS and proning. This was because there is a slight change in how you do these cases, and also to be quick, sleek, and so to reduce the exposure time with these patients. So we did simulation training for these things. The next important thing which we did was identifying the negative pressure isolation rooms. So the main thing about this negative pressure isolation rooms, we're having an ante room. So which is ours is a 16-bedded ICU. So we had 2 negative pressure ICU rooms, which was used as our isolation, where most of the time we dealt with all the AGP procedures, that is aerosol generating procedures in these negative pressure rooms. So any patient who comes for intubation or for a period of CPAP or anything, they were initially admitted in these negative pressure rooms. The other thing which we also did, which was interesting, was what is called MERIT, as in Medical Emergency Rapid Intubating Team. So every day we had 3 teams lined up as MERIT teams, as in 2 anesthetists and 1 critical care nurse. who were sent out for any cases which needed to be brought into ITU from the ward or from ER. So basically, they would have a grab bag of both all the kit and as well as the drugs with them to be able to bring the patients safely if needed to be intubating even on the way. The other thing is about the search planning and all the other things which needed was also done by the management part of the team. One most important thing also is the fit testing for all the staff. As you might have been aware that there are different kinds of FFP3 masks, so and N95 masks. So each person, each medical staff were asked to have a fit testing done. And if they failed a fit testing, then they were given a Jupiter hood. So the hood which we were talked about were given to those people who failed the fit testing. Next slide, please. So now this is with regards to preparation. And when we also had the senior as our clinical lead, Dr. Davis, and one nurse in charge, as well as one legal person who were look at all the referrals which were coming into the hospital or into our ICU from the ward to make a decision whether the patient is fit for receiving our ICU care. In the meantime, NHS also produced this decision support tool, which mainly looks at the age of the patient, the clinical fragility scores, and also the comorbidities. So depending on these three, the scores are given out. And depending on the scores, whether the full escalation of treatment or whether they have to be a limited support, which will be given to the patient at the level of ward care or even a HDU level care was decided. This helped us a lot in reducing the surge because we were expecting much more than what really has come in the last few weeks. So definitely this has helped us to reduce our surge and manage our resources, basically. Next slide, please. So now, as Dr. Diwan was saying about the pathophysiology, about the two types of cases which we see. So what we, yes, everybody agrees that the early phase, we are finding what is called early acute pneumonitis. So this is a period when the compliance of the lung is very good in spite of having a significant hypoxia. Not very clear where, probably, yes, it could be a VQ mismatch in these cases. They seem to be responding well with high flow oxygen. And what we are also doing on the ward is conscious proning. So these patients are encouraged to some of the patients are later on who are also, initially we also thought that CPAP may not do, because we thought it is as a aerosol generating procedure and we didn't want it to go down the CPAP route. We were thinking of early intubation. But then within a week or two, we realized those patients who were intubated were not doing well. We had a high mortality in that group. So that is when we started off around the second week after our first case. 15th of March, we got our first case. And around second week, we started starting using CPAP, and we had good results with them. So now what how our hospital is managing is, we have got CPAP wards, CPAP BiPAP wards, so which are being manned by the respiratory physicians. So those patients who are not requiring very high oxygen requirement, but are requiring positive pressure, are admitted on this CPAP wards. And they seem to be doing well. And once these patients are not coping with like moderate levels of oxygen, then they are being referred to ICU. And depending on their scores, they are admitted on to ICU. So, even if we trial our CPAP in our ICU, the main thing is to recognize when the CPAP is failing, whether it is an increased respiratory rate or tiring of the patient, which becomes quite obvious. Then we recommend early intubation of these patients. The second phase is the ARDS or the stiff lungs phase. Again, when we started with the in the second week, third week of March, we were literally going according to the ArtsNet protocol, and with a high PEEP and keeping the patient very dry, similar to what we managed these patients in SARS, and then found that again these patients were not doing well. What we then looking at the VQ mismatch, which is still a major issue in these patients, even in the ARDS stiff lung patients. We have now come down on the PEEP adjustments, what we are kept compared to what we have been doing before. Again, one important thing which we found was very helpful is this proning. Quite a lot of these patients are requiring multiple attempts at multiple episodes of proning, about 5 to 6 times before they start turning around the corner, and then they seem to be doing better. Next slide, please. Coming to the investigations, what we found, what has been helpful is, apart from the routine investigations, yes, which has helped us to a certain extent risk stratify is the D-dimers. Yes, routine CRPs and white cell counts are very high. Some patients, it may not be that high, that when the viral load is not too bad with those patients. They seem to be having a CRP is okay and white cell is also normal. When the white cell is high, yes, you have to suspect whether there is a bacterial infection along with this viral. But procalcitonin is in these patients are helping us tease out which are the cases which really require antibiotics and which doesn't need antibiotics. Again, risk stratification we are finding with D-dimers, ferritin levels, and fibrinogen. PT is not that, yes, it might be prolonged in a couple of cases, but not that much has been helpful in our cases. And platelet count, only one case we have had a very low platelet counts, and yes, it was not a good outcome in that patient. Other investigations like troponin and BNP, we are keeping it aside only for those patients who show tachyarrhythmias or any cardiac abnormalities. Echo is being commonly used, especially if we are suspecting patients might be having because of the VQ mismatch, if we think that patient is having possibility of a thrombus, that is to check up on the right-sided pressures, we are frequently asking for the echo. CT scan has not been of much help in our cases. Rarely we have used it. Yes, again, if we are going to use CT scan, we should rather go with the CTPA. I completely agree with Dr. Devan in that aspect. See, what is interesting in these cases is serum lactate levels are, even though these patients are hypoxic and may be requiring double-strength noradrenaline, quite moderate doses, they seem to be having normal serum lactate levels. And again, the other thing is even if these patients, some of them may not be diabetic, they are having very high sugar levels and really difficult to manage them on the sliding scales as well. Probably due to the illness COVID itself, because we have had 3 cases which has come as a DKA presentation rather than any hypoxia or any other symptom. But then our level of suspicion was where we could kind of intubate the patient and manage the patient as a COVID case. Next slide, please. Now, coming to other specific medical management, most of the cases in UK are being managed only by supportive care. So there is general supportive care, and until you are on any of the research trials. The one which we are enrolled to is a recovery trial, and in that we are not chosen all the limbs. We have gone with the recovery trial with the dexamethasone 6.6 milligram, or the other limb being hydroxychloroquine and as an antivirals. So this is the 3 limbs which we are using in our hospital, and depending on that, they get the management. So otherwise, it's general supportive care. So fluid management, initially, because we were all following the ArtsNet protocol, or SARS was in our mind, we were drying out the patient. We were trying to keep them as negative as possible. And literally, we had high difficulty in not only increased VQ mismatch, but also we found that high levels of renal failure in these patients. So now with the consensus in the teams, we are finding that neutral to slightly positive balance is what is beneficial. And especially because they are having this VQ mismatch, we are generous in the first 3 to 4 days to give about 1 liter to 2 liters positive in the first few days. Now, antimicrobials, the empirical treatment, and after the, if the CRP and the white cell are high, and then the procalcitonin is done. If procalcitonin is less than 2, we stop the empirical antimicrobials unless the sputum or anything else shows us like yes, possibility of other infection. Then we continue with the antibiotics. Immunomodulation therapy, we are not in the trial, so we are not enrolled any of the patient on any immunomodulation. Steroids, yes, we are in the recovery trial with the dexamethasone 6.6 milligram once a day. And at the moment, we haven't found any different or any beneficial outcome in these patients. Now, antivirals and macrolides seems to be, again, depending on the, we have yet to see what is the result out of these patients, out of these group. Next slide, please. So already Dr. Diwan was talking about the procoagulation. Completely agree that we are roughly having about 30% of patients having one form or the other form of thrombus, either induced or spontaneous. So we have had patients with arterial lines having thrombus in the arterial because of that is the induced, or cannulas, or suddenly spontaneous thrombus also. So you have to be very vigilant of these cases. Again, very high VQ mismatch, and hypoxia could be more related to due to this microthrombi, which is again very difficult to identify them because not all the patients we are sending them on the CTPA or doing any other tests, relevant tests. So we are looking for fibrinogen levels, and we are also looking at D-dimers. And if we are finding the D-dimers more than 3,000, roughly about that, and some of the or most of the patient, about 60% of the patients are having fibrinogens more than 10, then we are considering to use high levels of prophylactic low molecular weight heparin. There is no strong evidence why we are doing that, but yes, we are doing that, and quite a few hospitals, that is even Imperial College London, is also using that as one of their treatment modules. Next slide, please. Coming to the other issues which we have come across is renal failure. About 20% of our patients are having renal failure, but those patients who have had renal failure, the mortality is very high. So unless they are in all the other systems, they are looking better, we are not putting them into CRRT. So those patients, so far for those patients who have had gone into CRRT, only 1 patient has survived, remaining 4 have deceased. So we are not very sure why there is a significant renal failure. The other thing which we are finding with this renal failure is it is not when the sepsis or in the first day or the second day we are finding the renal failure. We are finding more so around 3rd and 4th day renal failure common in this group. Again, could it be because of the microthrombus is a question mark. The other very interesting in this patients is secretion management. As in, we initially, we were worried about the aerosol generation, and so we were not for wet circuits. We were using dry circuit with a HME filter. And what we found is even though the patient's peeps were coming down and the patient was looking clear chest, suddenly would plug off. And then complete de-recruitment, back to square one with high pressure ventilation and everything. So this has become a very common feature, maybe because of the secretions being as a patient presents with a dry cough. And then also these patients, we are keeping them fluid management wise very neutral to negative balance. So now we are using wet circuits, especially around day 3, day 4, we are changing over them to heated wet circuits. We are still not in the favor of any nebulization. because the issue of like what to say, disconnection, or even for adding in the medications and other things. That is aerosol generation point of view. We are not using the nebulization, but we are in favor of a wet circuit or also other mucolytic agents. These are the things which we have come across as our learning lessons in these cases compared to other cases which so far. That's about it from us. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I have a question and a comment. You said that out of the 350 patients that you have treated so far in your center,
Yeah.
there have been about 50 odd deaths.
Yes.
That's about 15%. That's probably approaching the highest number of deaths from any center globally at this time. Is there a reason? Is there a particular pattern?
So if you look at ICNAC data, so far, what is happening is if you look at the total ICNAC data when you're looking at ITU admissions, number of cases who are dying, that is ICU, is coming around to 50 to 60% mortality. But when you are looking at our data, why we are looking at this is 250 cases, 250 cases in the whole hospital. Out of that, 58 is our death. Quite a lot of our patients, but out of this 58, only 18 are ICU death. The remaining 40 are non-ICU death. That is because they are not fitting into our the NHS tool. We are not favoring for them to be admitted into ICU at all. Mm-hmm. So they are like limitation. There is a treatment limitation for them. So with that, our death rate will be high.
That's what you mean. So yeah, the point that you were making about kidney failure, so dialysis and COVID, for some reason, appears to be having a very strong poor prognostic kind of a story in our centers as well in India. So I'm not sure why that is. Maybe if there is a nephrologist in the people who are attending this webcast, maybe they would like to comment. But certainly that's one thing that we are grappling with ourselves. For some reason, people who are on dialysis, people who are stable, tend to be doing very suddenly, people tend to be doing badly. So we'd like to find out ourselves. Unfortunately, we are not yet in the story where we are going to be conducting autopsies, but that's something that we should be doing. I think that's the only way to learn, but not doing it as yet.
Yeah, interestingly, it might be anecdotal, but I'm not very sure. So we had one patient who was young and whom we felt that the full level of escalation has to be done. And she was supposed to go on for filtration. And so we anticoagulated her in perspective of for filtering. And unfortunately, her lung started deteriorating very badly. So we decided to prone her. So we are not sure whether proning, whether VQ matching or the anticoagulation, her renal function also started improving once we had anticoagulated her. So again, that is why I said I'm not very sure where the cause for this thing is. Could it be microthrombi again in the renal? Not sure. Urea seems to be, if you look at the urea creatinine ratio, again, urea seems to be much high, saying that, yes, we might be drying them out much more than what we should be doing. Again, whether should we sacrifice the lungs over the kidneys, it's again debatable.
It's debatable. Okay, we'll take 3 questions before we start the panel discussions. 3 questions, please.
Dr. Hemant, sir.
So how was the experience with cytokine storm? So that was one question. And how do you manage that?
That's coming in the debate. Please hold on to that question.
Yeah. How to prevent the cytokine storm? Hello?
Yeah, so just hold on to that question. That's coming in the debate. We'll take that question in the debate.
Okay.
Was that the one? Okay, in that case, I'm going to be starting with the panel discussion. First up, thank you, Dr. Sri Lakshmi, and welcome to the panel. Yes,
Thank you.
let me invite Dr. Sri Lakshmi to be one of the panelists. I am going to be calling Dr. Anand Sanghi as well to please join in the panel, and of course, welcome Pradeep. Dr. Bhattacharya, please join in the panel as well.
So,
yeah, okay. I'm about to start. So, look, there are a number of questions that are set aside here in the list that I've got them, but because I am going to be looking at the entire story from the point of view of the clinical aspects and maybe a little bit of immunology, I'm going to modify these questions slightly. Yes. So I'm going to start with you, Pradeep. Can I start with you?
yeah.
All right. So what are your thoughts on two separate categories? Patients who are testing positive for the throat swab, positive but asymptomatic, and positive and symptomatic.
So, what is your question, sir, in this regard?
The question is, Pradeep, how much will you give attention to a patient who has tested positive for the throat swab but is asymptomatic? How do you want to treat him?
I think asymptomatic patients can be given a home quarantine. There is no need of keeping them in a hospital. But as soon as they develop some kind of symptoms, they should be hospitalized. However, all those symptomatic patients, because as such, if you look at the hospitals, otherwise what will happen, the entire hospital will get full of asymptomatic patients. And that is what is happening in our hospital at present. What we see that nearly 80% of those patients are asymptomatic, and their tests, many of them, their tests are awaited. And even if the test has come positive and they are symptomatic, they can be home quarantined. And if they are symptomatic, they should be admitted in the hospital for further management.
Okay, if they are asymptomatic, they should be hospitalized for further management. Okay. Anand, I'm coming to you. What are your thoughts on HCQ prophylaxis?
Sir, as per ICMR directives, we have to use HCQ prophylaxis for healthcare providers who are in direct contact to a COVID patient or in contact to a patient who has is a family member who is COVID positive. So HCQ prophylaxis, as per directives of ICMR, we have to give in a dose of 400 milligram day 1, then followed by 200 milligram BD for day 2 to 4. But what I have seen in my small experience that HCQ may be working in a mild case, but in severe cases, I am a little doubtful that whether it is working or not. Because in our setup, we have to stop, in my ICU, I have to stop HCQ and AZ combination because of long QT intervals. And more or less, these patients have not received this prophylaxis. I have to stop on day 1 or either on day 2. So maybe it is working in mild cases. Still debatable, sir. There is no definitive evidence regarding the use of HCQ.
Okay.
US FDA has given that is one of the recently they have approved this drug, off-label use of this drug for this COVID-19 patients.
But definitely those patients who are old age having comorbidities, they should have a baseline ECG before using this hydroxychloroquine.
They should have a baseline ECG before starting hydroxychloroquine. Anand, my question really is, when you say that you take this for 2 days or 3 days or 4 days, is that the extent of prophylaxis that you're seeking? Because this exposure is going to go on for weeks and weeks and weeks, if not months. So how useful is going to be 4 days of prophylaxis?
Yes, a prophylactic dose is basically 400 milligram on day 1 and then once a week for 7 weeks. So, and the half-life of hydroxychloroquine is around 20-22 days. It's a pretty long half-life.
Yes, I think that's the question I was asking. That is actually in your system for at least 3 weeks, 3 weeks of time. And so, yes, let me also ask you, I mean, can I ask you, in your patients that I'm sure you'd be seeing of, say, connective tissue disorders, rheumatoid arthritis, I tend to use a lot of HCQ, 400 milligrams once a day for maybe 3, 4, 5 years. I have not seen a problem so far. So is there an overabundance of caution in the use of HCQ, because as an immunomodulator, it's probably one of the best drugs around.
You are right, sir. As an immunomodulator, it's a good drug, and all rheumatologists are using it right and left since many years. And now it is either this combination of azithromycin SCQ creating problem with the QTC intervals. It's very difficult to say, but mostly it looks like some interaction is happening and which is causing this QT prolongation.
No, both Dr. Om, both of them when are given, they have got a synergistic effect as far as complications of heart is concerned, and mostly the complications has been seen when these two drugs are combined. That is, and that is why in the treatment it is written that you should combine.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have to say, although even I'm moderating this, I have to tell you quickly in one line, I don't use a combination of HCQ and azithromycin. I don't think that's a very viable option. We should probably stick to HCQ, and that's what, in my limited experience, is what I tend to use. Dr. Sri Lakshmi, can I come to you, please?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about the question that we were discussing, Dr. Diwan and myself? What are your thoughts about antibody testing, and what are your thoughts about neutralizing antibodies?
We have not yet started any antibody testing in Peterborough, at least. Yeah. So with regards to antibody testing, probably we are looking at those who are exposed, as in the medical professions seem to be the ones who are going to be requiring, or there is an advantage of having antibody testing. With regards to the patients that, as Dr. Diwan was saying earlier, many of them have, even though they are exposed and even though we know that they are PCR positive and they've gone through the disease, the antibodies are they do not have any amount of antibodies. So it's difficult in those patients what is the role of neutralizing antibodies is going to do, because they have got better.
There is a theoretical probability that yes, it gives some better outcome. I don't know. There are good evidences against it or not. I think it is yet to see good evidence.
I think that some part of what I am asking is probably going to be relevant only when we know, say in about 3 or 6 months from here, as to what is the quantity of neutralizing antibodies. As an immunologist, of course, look, that's a huge amount of interest for me, but I'm sorry, I'm not going to go into that on this platform. Maybe at another platform, if Alcom would like to discuss that, I'd be very happy to share why a neutralizing antibody is so critical. Okay, Anand, coming back to you now.
No.
Is there a way to predict who is going to go into worsening? Do you have any parameters to look at that?
Yes, sir. The patients who are in ward, the patients which we are admitting in ward with mild disease, I have directed all my residents and the junior doctors to have a look on their respiratory rate. This is the most important parameter. Look out their work of breathing, their use of accessory muscles, look out their fatigueness, their hemodynamic stability, vital parameters, and more of if they are having air hunger, then and if there is a progressive increase in oxygen requirement in the wards, then we are shifting these patients immediately to the ICU for further management and close monitoring. So respiratory rate is very important, and progressive increase in oxygen requirement, breathing is very important.
Okay. All right, Pradeep, I'm going to direct the next question to you. Is there a particular biomarker that you rely upon in terms of predicting which patients are going to get better and which ones are going to get worse?
I don't see that till date any biomarker has been investigated which tells us about condition, whether this patient will get worse or not. Because till date, I don't see that anything is there from no evidence.
No evidence. Absolutely no evidence.
Yes, somebody says lymphopenia, D-dimer, all these things are there, but I think there is no study as such.
Okay.
Which, actually suggests that.
Then let me direct the question to Dr. Sri Lakshmi. Do you end up using? So I'll tell you what I end up using, but tell me your thoughts on this. Do you end up using any amount of tumor necrosis factor alpha in your practice?
No.
How do you quantify interleukin-6 in your practice?
No, not at all. And I don't think so. Any of the hospitals nearby have been using. We are not using it.
Okay. Okay. What about you, Anand?
No, sir, we don't have the facility of measuring IL-6 levels and TNFL.
So I would like to share again this. Since I'm the moderator, I'm not going to share my thoughts. But again, I'd like that. There is a reason I'm asking this question. But maybe once all the questions are over, and if there is some time, maybe we can have a look at what TNF alpha and what IL-6 can do, especially in relation to one of the drugs. So coming back to you, Anand, what about the treatment protocols? Although I don't think that this is the right platform to talk about non-pharmacological treatment. Would anybody like to comment from the panel about non-pharmacological treatment?
Nothing, just we have started in our hospital in morning and evening time. We are counseling the patients and the relatives, and the staff is singing a song. That is the non-pharmacological therapy which we are giving to relieve their mental stress.
What about you, Pradeep?
I think all these things are shown day and night in the television. We don't need to tell all these things to our experts who are specialists in intensive care unit.
Okay. So I'd like to know from Dr. Sri Lakshmi, do you find that the resources that are available to you, do you feel that they could be more given to you? Do you think that might make your patient care better, or are you happy with the kind of? So I'm not going to comment on the NHS, but does resource limitation mean anything to you at all? Do you have access to all the things that you need?
So we do have access to all the things we need. The problem, or like I think the mindset which the NHS has made is like we ask the question of evidence base. So we do not, at the moment, there is nothing which is showing us that there is a good evidence for particular treatment which is going to make a difference to our management. So without that evidence, it's difficult for us to ask, yes, if this was there, my outcome would have been different. So it's really difficult. So with whatever the evidence is being shown, I think we are doing good. Yes, we could be doing more research in other things, but again, research should show us that there is a better outcome. So far, whatever the research is showing, there is no change in the outcome with whatever the limbs they are following. Maybe convalescent therapy, we are hearing good things about it, convalescent plasma, but we are not yet, we have to yet see the result out of it.
Yeah. Okay.
Dr. Om, you are talking about IL-6. I saw a couple of days back that there is one drug, sarilumab. And it was tried in this condition, and it is an inhibitor of interleukin-6, and the trial is going there in China, but it has not come out with any successful outcome.
No, I have to say, Pradeep, I'll probably answer this question once we've done with all the questions. There is a very specific role of a number of agents that will inhibit IL-6, except that IL-6 has multiple polymorphisms. So one drug with one laboratory measurement of IL-6, or even without a laboratory measurement, to say that the outcome was not appropriate or the outcome was fatal, does not make that the drug is being correctly positioned or used. I'd like to talk much more about this, but this is probably not the right platform. I'm going to get on with these questions if there is a little bit of time, and if Alchem agrees, I'd like to spare a few minutes to talk about this. I have to ask you, Pradeep, while we are here, what are your thoughts on non-invasive ventilation?
Personally, as far as the literatures are concerned, obviously things are a bit confusing, but in the initial phase, definitely nowadays the things which are coming out, they suggest that non-invasive ventilation, the patient comes out with non-invasive ventilation, nothing can be better than that. But and if we put the patient on invasive ventilation, the outcomes are becoming more and more worse. But on the other hand, I see if you have a very good negative pressure ICU, there we have got that freedom of using non-invasive ventilation, where this all those airborne droplets and droplet infections can be avoided. And the persons who are taking care of, if they are properly protected, and the entire team, if you say they are properly protected with PPEs, then I see that yes, obviously, non-invasive ventilation should be tried in the initial phase till we see that yes, now invasive ventilation is a must. Till that time, we can always wait. Because earlier experiences with swine flu patients, I also again say that yes, swine flu patients always did better with non-invasive ventilation as compared to invasive ventilation. So similarly, I feel that in corona patients also, non-invasive ventilation in long run is going to give better outcome.
Okay, okay. Anand, this next question is directed to you. I understand that you've got a fair amount of experience with teclisumab. You want to share that with us?
Yeah, sir. So currently, sir, I have a small experience of 20 patients in my ICU, out of which there is, we ventilated 7 patients and all 7 patients died unfortunately. But thereafter we started using NIV. I just want to make a small comment on NIV. So we started using NIV, and these patients are till date is all our patients are doing well. They all came with saturation of 70-80%, but surprisingly they were fully conscious, alert, communicable, not disoriented, and they tolerated the hypoxia very well. So we started giving them NIV and we got the good results. All patients are improving. They are doing very well. Regarding the tocilizumab, sir, it is basically an IL-6 inhibitor. IL-6 is a marker of cytochrome, early indicator of cytochrome storm, which is mostly seen in the second week of the disease process. And we have no facility of measuring IL-6 levels, unfortunately, but we are using, I use the indirect markers in the form of ferritin, in the form of LDH and CRP values, and neutrophilic lymphocytic ratio for prognostication. So I have used tocilizumab in my 3 patients, and seeing the rise in the ferritin level 3 times their higher, 3 times their normal values, and they are sky high, more than 5,000 levels was there. The CRP was also exponentially rising, and there was further lymphopenia. The NLR ratio is getting worse and worse. So we decided to give tocilizumab in this patient, although there is only a single organ injury, that too is the lung. So we tried that, we gave tocilizumab, and after giving tocilizumab, one patient, after 48 hours, he himself told me that now I am feeling better, now I am getting the sense of smell and taste. So that is very good relief for us that probably this drug has done something to him. And another 2 patients we have given just day before yesterday, and till date they are also holding on, and their ferritin levels and CRP levels have started decreasing. So in my small experience, I feel that it's working. But you have to choose the patients wisely. You have to measure the ferritin, CRP, and your LDH levels daily, and see the CBC and with differentials, the NLR ratio.
Okay, so have you had the opportunity to use this drug in any more than 1 dose? Because we say 400 milligram dose, but I used to have 400 milligrams twice in about 7 patients. So altogether, my experience is about 17 patients.
Sir.
But I've used it 400 milligrams twice in about 7 patients. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sir, I have used only a single dose of 400 milligram, and that too I have given slowly. And as of now, the patient is doing well. I am planning to repeat the CT scan, and then if the patient is improving, then I will hold on with the next dose. If not, then we'll see, depending on the indirect markers of ferritin and CRP and LDH. But we have used single vial with a 400 milligram single dose.
Okay. Dr. Sri Krishna, can I get you to comment upon the plasma therapy in your centers or any of the centers that you're researching with?
Dr. Sri Lakshmi, your video's paused, ma'am. I think she has some internet issues, sir.
Does she? Okay. All right. We'll then go to then go to the remaining 2 panelists. Actually, I'm going to start having closing comments. Pradeep, before we close off, can you give me your thoughts upon those therapies which are emerging therapies? What do you think about some of the therapies that have been tried, including antiretrovirals and drugs like colchicine, and drugs like some antiparasitic agents. Can you give me your thoughts on those? Something like ivermectin?
Yeah, I tell you, there are nearly 7 to 10 drugs on which various trials are going on. One of them is vascular endothelial growth factor inhibitor, that is bevacizumab. And the trial is going on in China, where we have to see what is the outcome. Then colchicine, people are trying because they have found that it has got a very good effect in gout, and they are trying that it may work in this disease. Again, we are waiting for the result. The trial is going on in China again. Then favipiravir is antiviral agent, which has entered the third phase of its trial again in China in the name of Avigan. The drug is named as Avigan, and it is going through its third phase. And I think very soon we are going to get the results. Then another drug is fingolimod. That fingolimod is basically a drug which is used for multiple sclerosis. So people are trying on this drug, and most likely, again, it is going on in China, and results are awaited. Then ivermectin, obviously, that is one drug which is being tried, and it's antiparasitic agent, and the trial is going in Australia. People are trying this drug, and I think we have to wait for the results. Then another drug is leronlimab. Leronlimab is an anti-cytokine surge agent. It goes against the cytokine surge, and the trial is going in USA. And in United States, they are finding that in Israel also people are trying with this drug, and they say that yes, it has got some good effect. And obviously, in our country also, we know that this lopinavir and ritonavir has been tried, and they have found that yes, some good results they have seen. But again, when we look at the wider angle, we find that yes, outcomes are not very good as far as other worldwide trials are concerned. And then methylprednisolone, obviously, it has again not shown a very good result. But when the patient is hypotensive, definitely at a very low dose of hydrocortisone, 1 milligram per kg body weight, it has shown some good effects. So I think these are the drugs, as per my knowledge, which are going through various trials in various parts of the world.
So we'll have to wait and watch, Pradeep. Yes, we'll have to wait and watch. So okay, all right, Anand, your thoughts on the benefits of the BCG vaccine and the oral polio vaccine. Can you comment on either of those or both of those?
So the BCG vaccine, the trial is still going on, whether they are effective or not. But some studies say that Indians have taken the BCG vaccine, so it may be working. So still it is in the, we are learning, and still I don't know whether how effective it is regarding the BCG.
Okay. And finally, I've got a question that I would like to direct to our third panelist. Do you have any comments or thoughts on plasma therapy? How are things at your center? What do you feel about that? I think that we're still
Dr. Sri Lakshmi, are you there?
Hello?
Yeah, Dr. Sri Lakshmi.
Yeah. No, we haven't yet started using convalescent plasma. As I said, it's being tried out in Birmingham and in more of that centers. Yet to what we are hearing is good results, but we haven't had any much experience in that in our center.
Okay, so I suppose the one thing that like the rest of the world, I'm sure you'll be following with great interest the human trials that have started today at Oxford of the first vaccine.
Yeah.
But yes, hopefully by January of next year, you'll be having the vaccine on your table. Yes.
The issue is biggest question is this mutations are going to be only these many strains we are going to have? Are there going to be further more strains? And if that is a thing, whether that vaccine, whatever is being now tested, will it be able to cover those? That's the question, isn't it?
Well, the question is actually, it's a question to open maybe 100 other questions, because I'll tell you why. It is a sly virus. It's an RNA virus, okay, with a kind of the point mutations that have already occurred, which are 30 already. From if you look at it, from December to April, I mean, April is not yet over, there have been about 30 point mutations. That's about 10 point mutations every month. Yes. So any vaccine that attempts to be covering every strain that has been seen, from starting from China, going on to Europe, then on to Iran, and then on to Middle East, Saudi Arabia, then further down, coming down to Dubai, and then to India. Any vaccine that attempts to cover every strain will need to be ahead of the curve. So it's a big task to try and do that. But look, you'll have to start somewhere.
Yeah, positive.
Yeah.
It's a positive attitude. At least we should hope like something is going to come. Yes.
Oh, yes, of course. So closing comments. Would you like to give closing comments?
Yes, sir. May I?
Yes, please go ahead.
So I have 4 points to say. That we should not blame ventilator. It is the disease per se which is bad, and in the patients who needs ventilation. So ventilation is just a support system. NIV, in my experience, is doing a remarkable job. The patients are getting out on my ICU on NIV. Tocilizumab is as of now doing good in my ICUs, and I'm getting a good results. And I have used low dose early steroids also. And that too is also giving me some good results as of now. And all patients should receive anticoagulation early from day one to prevent in a prophylactic dose, if required, if with rising D-dimer in a therapeutic dose as well, to prevent thrombosis and keep volemia in the patient. Thank you, sir.
Good.
Dr. Om.
Pradeep.
I'm Dr. Om. Yes,
Pradeep,
yes.
Closing comments from you.
No, I think I will like to say that, see, this is a viral infection, and from ancient times also, and from the last 20 years, what we are seeing with so many viral infections, which has come one after another, and every time we try to find out something good, some kind of drug, and finally we land up with only conservative management, and that's all. The oseltamivir definitely was a helpful drug as far as swine flu was concerned. But again, it was the conservative management which usually mattered for better outcomes. And as early as possible, we started, better we got the outcomes. So my thinking is that whenever anybody feels that yes, a patient is developing some or other kind of symptoms, which is can be correlated with a viral infection, an early intervention in the form of, I know that all of you know that yes, our desi techniques, what we follow in India, like hot saline gargle, hot milk, and taking hot drinks and everything, taking good sleep and taking good rest, because it is always said rest is the best treatment for viral infection. So I think we should not forget all those things and keep all these apart, modern medicine and whatever supportive system we have. But definitely those things also have to play a very big role as far as corona infection is concerned.
Wonderful. Dr. Sri Krishna, closing comments from you?
Yeah, I think the main 4 things which I think I agree with both the other speakers is yes, NIV, CPAP works. We also have got good results with CPAP. Now, proning. I think proning is something which we can aim even in the patients who are not requiring ICU, who are just on the ward with oxygen. They should be encouraged to prone. Even last night, I had 2 patients who were new patients who came on, and yeah, CPAP, and they were able to, when you explain to them, they can prone themselves with the CPAP mask on. Then definitely anticoagulation part. I think with looking at the whole picture, microthrombi should be like thought through in every stage of this whole disease, whether kidneys we are looking at, or whether we are looking at even the lungs. We have to think of how we can help out or manage this microthrombi disease. Those will be my thoughts.
Okay, all right. So then okay, I'm now going to be coming to the end of this part of the panel discussion. So various insights about ventilatory approaches, non-invasive and invasive ventilatory approaches, prone positions, heparin, anticoagulation, the role of assessing which patients are likely to get worse, preempting that and treating that, the role of IL-6 inhibitors. That's of course a topic of a different debate, or a whole day. And if Alkem would like to do that, maybe we should consider doing that at some stage. The role of not to disregard, like Pradeep rightly says, those things that have worked for hundreds of years in our country, and that there must be a role for the benefit of those agents, not to disregard. For any questions on that regard, please get in touch with Dr. Pradeep Bhattacharya directly, and that he will be able to help you with all the things that he has in mind that he has not been able to share with us on this platform. I am going to stop here. If there are any questions and comments, this is a good time to speak up, because we would like to wind this up. We've exceeded the time that was given to us, but we'd like to wind this up at a very short time. So if there are questions, please speak up now.
So role of pegylated interferon.
The role of pegylated interferon, who are you directing that question to?
Dr. Anand can answer this.
Dr. Anand?
Sorry, sir, I could not hear it. Role of?
The pegylated interferon, peg interferon.
Truly speaking, I have not any experience about this. Maybe you are the best person to answer this.
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So look, there's definitely a role. The interferon mechanism actually functions through a pathway which is very crucial to lung injury. It's called the arachidonic acid pathway, and that what you're trying to inhibit is that part, because that is also the pathway that works in combination with a number of antiplatelet agents, especially the aspirin pathways or ibuprofen pathways, which is one of the other potent antiplatelet agents that we tend to disregard. The role of pegylated interferon cannot be overemphasized, but it's got to be targeted. You've got to pick your patient correctly. As of now, the evidence is theoretical, but it is definitely going to have a role unless there are other confounders to the whole pathophysiological process that may not make it as efficacious as it sounds at this time. But otherwise, based on the evidence available at this time, I think there's definitely going to be a role.
Fantastic.
That's fine. Keeping time in mind, I think one last question, sir.
Please also directed to.
Regarding pulmonary embolism, use of TPA and how much. Yeah, I think Dr. Srilakshmi can take up this. How much use of TPA for pulmonary embolism, and how much PTI, AC and D-dimer should we keep to prevent pulmonary embolism?
Again, the D-dimers in itself will not. Yes, people are talking about like more than 6 times of the norm. D-dimers are something to consider for any pulmonary embolism or microthrombi is there. But again, even when we have got any patient coming in with a D-dimers of 4,000, unless we have a CTPA proven embolism, we do not give a TPA. We are not going to thrombolize them. So if you are looking at thrombolytic agents like TPA, I think you should have full evidence before you do that. So yes, some other areas people are talking of full anticoagulation with low molecular weight heparin. People are considering. We are not doing it. We are increasing the dose, or if they have got any other thing to show that there is thrombotic events or thromboembolic events going on, like any arterial or the venous thromboembolism, then we are using therapeutic doses.
Okay. So back to you, Dr. Om.
Okay. Well, I am going to take this opportunity to thank each one of the panelists. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
And thank you also to the other participants who have, we've not had a chance to interact with so much this evening. Thank you also to Alchem. I'm going to sign off at this note. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you from Alchem.
Thank you, Al.
Thank you. Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
all the panelists and Dr. Om Srivastava being a chair. It was an excellent session. Special thanks to Dr. Sri Lakshmi for getting time, and thanks to all the attendees. Thanks all of you, and we will be connecting soon in our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dick. Thank you.